This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Racial policy had an impact on educational policy. Propaganda went hand in hand with repression, and so on. So the treatment of a theme in a particular chapter is necessarily incomplete in itself, and the individual chapters should not be treated as comprehensive accounts of the topics with which they deal. Thus, for example, the removal of the Jews from the economy is dealt with in the chapter on the economy, rather than in the chapter on racial policy. Hitler's formulation of his war aims in the so-called Hossbach Memorandum in 1937 is covered in the section on rearmament, rather than in the chapter on foreign policy. And the impact of the German takeover of Austria on anti-Semitism in the Third Reich is discussed in the final chapter, rather than in the section on anti-Semitism in 1938. I hope that these decisions about the structure of the book make sense, but their logic will only be clear to those who listen to the audiobook consecutively from start to finish. Anyone who wants to use it simply as a work of reference is recommended to turn to the index, where the location of the book's principal themes, characters, and events is laid out in detail. Richard J. Evans, Cambridge, May 2005. Prologue 1. The Third Reich came to power in the first half of 1933 on the ruins of Germany's first attempt at democracy, the ill-fated Weimar Republic. By July, the Nazis had created virtually all the fundamental features of the regime that was to govern Germany until its collapse almost 12 years later in 1945. They had eliminated open opposition at every level, created a one-party state, and coordinated all the major institutions of German society, with the exceptions of the army and the churches. Many people have tried to explain how they managed to achieve such a position of total dominance in German politics and society with such speed. One tradition of explanation points to long-term weaknesses in the German national character that made it hostile to democracy, inclined to follow ruthless leaders, and susceptible to the appeal of militarists and demagogues. But when one looks at the 19th century, one can see very little evidence of such traits. Liberal and democratic movements were no weaker than they were in many other countries. More relevant, perhaps, was the relatively late creation of a German nation-state. After the collapse in 1806 of the Holy Roman Reich, created by Charlemagne a millennium before, the famous thousand-year Reich that Hitler sought to emulate, Germany was disunited until the wars engineered by Bismarck between 1864 and 1871, which led to the formation of what was later called the Second Reich, the German Empire ruled by the Kaiser. In many ways, this was a modern state. It had a national parliament that, unlike its British counterpart, for example, was elected by universal manhood suffrage. Elections attracted a voter turnout of over 80%, and political parties were well organized and an accepted part of the political system. The largest of these, by 1914, the Social Democratic Party, had over 1 million members and was committed to democracy, equality, the emancipation of women, and the ending of racial discrimination and prejudice, including anti-Semitism. Germany's economy was the most dynamic in the world, rapidly overtaking the British by the turn of the century, and in the most advanced areas like the electrical and chemical industries, rivaling even the Americans. Middle-class values, culture, and behavior were dominant in Germany by the turn of the century. Modern art and culture were beginning to make their mark in the paintings of expressionists like Max Beckmann and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, the plays of Frank Wedekind, and the novels of Thomas Mann. Of course, there was a downside to the Bismarckian Reich. Aristocratic privilege remained entrenched in some areas. The national parliament's powers were limited, and the big industrialists, like their counterparts in the USA, were deeply hostile to unionized labor. Bismarck's persecution, first of the Catholics in the 1870s, then of the fledgling Social Democratic Party in the 1880s, got Germans used to the idea that a government could declare whole categories of the population enemies of the Reich and drastically curtail their civil liberties. The Catholics